A freezing winter at the harbor, weather none of us would want to endure, yet the little German shepherd dog had to suffer outdoors, whimpering in despair. The indifference and insensitivity of a group of people, they didn't care about it. Not far away, a Navy soldier approaches and discovers it. A sound and a figure he recognized from the old battlefield. What follows shows us that a cruel act will become a story of redemption, of two souls redeemed and a man learning to live again. Before we begin, please tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe for more. Snow fell thick and soundless over Cedar Harbor, swallowing the world in white. The docks were half buried under drifts, the old fishing boats creaking against their ropes, their masts coated in frost like bones frozen mid-motion. The air smelled of salt and rust and something old, something tired. Through the storm, a man walked with slow, deliberate steps, his boots leaving deep prints in the snow that the wind hurried to erase. Jake Harris kept his head down, his breath forming small clouds beneath the hood of his military parka. At 40, his face was weathered by years of war and cold, the kind of face that carried silence more comfortably than words. His jaw was square, dusted with the shadow of a beard he no longer cared to shave. A scar curved along his right temple, pale against his wind-burned skin, a quiet souvenir from Afghanistan. His eyes were a storm of their own, gray-green and unsteady, always searching the distance as if still expecting gunfire in the dark. Once those eyes had belonged to a Navy SEAL K-9 handler, a man who commanded with calm, trusted with absolute conviction, and never hesitated when others did. Now they belonged to someone who survived by habit rather than purpose. Beside him padded Shadow, his aging German shepherd. The dog's coat had dulled with time, the black fading to silver around his muzzle, but his body still moved with quiet power. His left ear bore a small tear, a relic of the battlefield, and his eyes, sharp, amber, loyal, flickered toward Jake every few seconds as if still awaiting an order. They had been together for nearly a decade, through deserts, storms, and empty years that followed. Shadow limped slightly on his hind leg, yet he walked as if pain was simply another routine. The night was a blur of wind and snow until Shadow suddenly halted, nose lifted, ears pricked. A low growl hummed in his throat. Jake followed the dog's gaze toward a narrow alley behind the last row of storage sheds, where an orange flicker danced faintly. Firelight. He hesitated. Few people lingered near the docks in this weather, and those who did were usually ghosts of the world, men without homes, warmth, or hope. Still, Shadow pulled forward, the leash taut in Jake's gloved hand. "Easy, boy," Jake muttered, but there was no stopping the dog. They turned into the alley. The wind dropped there, replaced by the crackle of a small fire. 3 men huddled close to it, wrapped in layers of torn jackets and blankets, stiff with frost. The smoke smelled of burnt wood and cheap whiskey. Their faces were hollow, cheeks sunken, beards unkempt, men who had once been someone and now were simply surviving. One of them looked up when Jake approached. His eyes were glassy but alert, his hands trembling slightly as he held them to the flame. "Ain't safe wandering here, friend," he rasped, his voice roughened by cold and years of alcohol. Jake said nothing. His gaze had already drifted to the corner of the alley where a small shape moved weakly against the snow. A puppy, thin as bone, its fur clumped with ice, tied by a nylon cord to a rusted pipe. The animal shivered, its ribs visible beneath its matted coat, eyes glazed but still flickering with something fragile, fear, or maybe the last thread of life. Jake's throat tightened. Shadow stepped closer, whined softly. The man by the fire followed Jake's stare and snorted. "Found it yesterday, digging through trash," he said. "Tried to eat a plastic bag. It's as good as dead. Let it go, soldier." The word hit Jake like a spark to old tinder. Soldier. He hadn't heard it said in months, not since he'd locked himself away in that cabin on the cliffs where the ocean howled like memory. The images came uninvited. Sand, smoke, the roar of an explosion, a leash slipping from his grasp, a bark cut short by the blast. Rex, his partner, his friend, the one he hadn't saved. He swallowed hard, pushing the image down. His boots crunched through the snow as he crouched beside the puppy. The creature didn't even flinch when he touched the cord, too weak to fight. Its tiny body was cold beneath his gloves, but there was still a faint heartbeat. "You don't leave anyone behind," Jake whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He pulled out his knife, slicing through the nylon. The puppy gave a soft whimper, a sound so small it barely existed against the wind. The men stared as Jake unzipped his parka, tucking the frail body against his chest. One of them laughed, a hollow sound. "It's dying, man. Waste of time." Jake rose slowly, meeting the man's eyes. For a heartbeat, the firelight reflected in those gray-green irises like steel catching flame. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but unyielding. "I don't leave anyone behind," he said, "not even a dog." He turned and walked out of the alley, Shadow following close. The wind hit him like a wall, but he didn't slow. The puppy stirred weakly beneath his coat, its head pressing faintly against his chest. He could feel the fragile rhythm of its breath, the uneven flutter like the echo of something trying to survive. Jake adjusted his grip, shielding it from the storm. As he crossed the frozen docks, the world blurred into white and wind again. The lights of Cedar Harbor glowed dimly in the distance, a handful of flickering windows from houses perched along the hill. He moved through the snow with steady purpose, his boots sinking deep with each step, the old injury in his knee sending dull pain up his leg. But he didn't stop. Each step was a promise, silent, instinctive, the kind he had once made to men under fire and now made to something far smaller. When he finally reached the narrow path leading to his cabin, the storm had thickened into a blinding sheet. The cliffs rose ahead, dark and jagged against the white sky. The sound of the ocean crashed. Faintly below, a constant pulse in the distance. Shadow stayed close, his fur dusted white, his breath coming in clouds. The puppy whimpered again, and Jake murmured, "Hold on, kid, just a little longer." By the time they reached the cabin, his hands were numb, his coat stiff with ice. He pushed through the door, the hinges groaning. The single-room space was dark and cold, its walls lined with old military gear and tools. He set the puppy gently on a folded blanket near the fireplace, then fumbled with the matches until a flame caught. The smell of burning pine filled the room, followed by warmth creeping slowly into the air. Shadow lay beside the puppy, curling his body to share heat. Jake knelt, rubbing the small creature's sides, trying to coax life back into its trembling form. Beneath his fingers, he could feel the heartbeat, faint but stubborn. For the first time in months, something inside him stirred too. He looked down at the two dogs, one old and scarred, one fragile and new, and felt the faintest tremor in the ice that had sealed his chest since Afghanistan. Outside, the storm howled against the cabin walls, but inside there was only the sound of breathing, 3 of them now, uneven but alive. Jake leaned back, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from memory. He thought of Rex again, of that final mission, the explosion, the leash slipping through his grip. He had buried more than a friend that day. He had buried a part of himself. But tonight, in the heart of a snowstorm, something small and helpless had crawled back into his arms, asking for a chance. Maybe this was it, not redemption, but the first step toward it. He glanced toward the window, where the snow still fell thick against the glass, hiding the world beyond. The light from the fire flickered across his scarred face. "You're safe now," he whispered to the tiny bundle of fur. "You hear me? You're safe." Shadow let out a soft, contented sigh and rested his head on his paws. Jake reached over, gently touching the old dog's ear. "Good boy," he murmured, then, more quietly to no one and everyone at once, "We don't leave anyone behind." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, warmth returned. Slow, fragile, but real. And for the first time in a long while, Jake Harris didn't feel entirely alone. Wind moaned through the cracks in the roof as dawn broke over Cedar Harbor. The cliffs stood like dark sentinels above the frozen ocean, and far below, waves crashed against the rocks with the sound of a slow heartbeat. In a cabin perched near the edge, more wood than structure, more memory than home, Jake Harris worked in silence. His hands, large and calloused, trembled slightly as he adjusted the damp logs in the old fireplace. The iron frame was rusted and bent, and each time he opened it, the hinge groaned as though remembering all the winters it had survived. Behind him, the room was sparse. A table scarred with knife marks, a shelf lined with a few ration tins, an old cot against the wall covered in military blankets. A faded photograph of his SEAL unit leaned crooked on the mantel. 6 men and 2 dogs, all squinting under the desert sun. Dust covered the glass. Jake hadn't touched it in months. He turned back to the small bundle beside the hearth. The puppy lay curled on a folded blanket, its fur still damp and patchy, its chest rising in shallow breaths. Shadow sat nearby, his muzzle close to the tiny body, breathing softly to keep it warm. Jake knelt, watching the pup's frail movement with the focus of a man defusing a bomb. Slow, cautious, afraid to hope. "Come on, kid," he murmured. "Stay with me." He took out an old canteen, poured a bit of lukewarm water into a metal cup, then mixed in powdered milk from his survival kit. His fingers moved by memory, the rhythm of a medic, a soldier, a man who once kept things alive under fire. He tested the warmth on his wrist, then filled a syringe and pressed the tip gently to the puppy's mouth. It stirred, its tiny tongue flicking once, then again. The sound it made was faint, but real. Jake exhaled shakily, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For 3 nights, he barely slept. He tended the fire, wrapped the puppy in towels, fed it every few hours with stubborn precision. Shadow watched from beside the bed, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight like twin embers. Sometimes Jake caught himself talking to both of them, the old dog and the new life, in the quiet, half-delirious way of someone who feared the silence might answer back. "You've got the easy job," he'd say to Shadow. "Just keep her breathing." On the second night, exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision. He sat in the wooden chair, elbows on his knees, watching the flames crawl up the logs. The hiss and pop of the fire mixed with the low howl of wind outside. He rubbed the scar at his temple, a nervous habit that had never left him. And then, without meaning to, his thoughts slipped backward. Afghanistan. The night that still woke him in flashes. Dust, shouting, the sharp smell of cordite. He remembered running through a narrow street, Rex at his side, the dog's body tense, ears locked forward. There had been gunfire. Close, too close, and a sudden explosion that split the world in two. The force had thrown him into a wall. When he came to, his radio was screaming and Rex was gone, just gone. He had dug through the rubble with his bare hands until someone pulled him back. He never forgave himself for letting go of that leash. The fire cracked, snapping him out of it. He realized his knuckles were white from gripping the chair's edge. "It's done," he told himself, the words low and harsh. "He's gone." But the ache didn't fade. Shadow shifted beside the blanket, pressing his body closer to the puppy. The old dog had seen too much. Jake could tell from the way his gaze sometimes lingered on the fire, like a man staring into memory. "You miss him too, don't you?" Jake whispered. Shadow's tail moved once, slow and heavy, as if in agreement. When the third morning came, pale light spilled through the cracked window, turning the frost on the glass into veins of silver. Jake stirred awake on the chair, his neck stiff. The fire had burned low to embers. For a second, he thought the small shape by the hearth was still. Panic surged through him. He leaned forward, hand trembling as he reached for the blanket. Then, a movement. The puppy stretched, gave a tiny yawn, and blinked open its eyes. They were a warm hazel, soft, but alive, glinting in the morning light. The sight hit Jake harder than any memory could. The puppy turned its head weakly toward his hand and licked his knuckle, a small, wet, clumsy gesture. Shadow let out a short, approving bark, the sound startling in the quiet. Jake froze, and then, for the first time in months, he laughed. Not loud, but real. It cracked through his chest like light breaking through cloud. "Well," he said softly, voice catching, "guess you made it." He reached out, brushing the pup's fur gently. "You're tougher than you look." He sat there for a long moment, letting the warmth of the fire and the fragile life beside it steady him. Then he said, almost to himself, "You need a name." He looked at the snow melting outside, the faint glimmer of morning sun on the horizon, the steady breath of the old dog watching over them both. Something quiet, something that belonged to the moment. He smiled faintly. "Hope," he said. "Yeah, you'll be Hope." The puppy blinked, as if listening. Shadow wagged his tail once, approval sealed. Jake leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. "Because you remind me it's still out there," he whispered, "even after everything." The day passed in slow peace. Jake repaired the fire grate, patched the cracks in the window with duct tape, boiled water for Shadow's food. The ordinary rhythm of living, simple, repetitive, grounding, began to return. The ghosts in his head didn't leave, but they were quieter, as if the small presence in the cabin had filled the empty spaces where they used to echo. That evening, as twilight deepened over the cliffs, Jake stood by the door looking out at the ocean. The sky had turned to iron gray, the last light bleeding through like embers. The air smelled of salt and pine. Shadow came to stand beside him, Hope asleep near the fire. "You remember when we used to be out there," Jake murmured. "You, me, and him. Feels like another life." The old dog pressed his head against Jake's thigh, silent understanding. Jake looked back at the small flame flickering in the hearth, the golden glow spilling across the floorboards. It was strange how something so small, a spark, a breath, a heartbeat, could feel like a miracle. He knew that tomorrow would bring the same gray sky, the same solitude, the same ache that waited at the edges of every day. But now, for the first time, he also knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Outside, the wind howled down the cliffside, carrying the sound of waves breaking against rock. Inside, a man, an old dog, and a newborn life sat together in the quiet, a fragile, flickering warmth against the endless cold. The snow had begun to melt along the main road of Cedar Harbor, leaving behind wet cobblestones that gleamed under the pale morning sun. The ocean wind carried the faint scent of salt and roasted coffee from somewhere nearby. Jake Harris drove his old pickup slowly down the narrow street, Shadow's head resting on the passenger seat and Hope curled up in a blanket between them. The puppy, now slightly stronger, whimpered softly with each bump on the road. Jake glanced over and reached out to steady the tiny body, his gloved hand brushing its fur. "Easy, Hope," he murmured. "You're going to be fine. We're almost there." He pulled up in front of a small wooden building with a faded sign that read Cedar Veterinary Clinic. The paint was chipped, the steps creaked, but the windows were filled with soft light, the kind of light that promised safety. Jake pushed open the door, and the smell of disinfectant and warm hay greeted him. Behind the counter, a woman looked up from her desk. Dr. Lydia Brooks was in her mid-40s, tall and slim, with a posture that spoke of quiet discipline. Her sandy brown hair was tied back in a loose braid, and fine lines framed her kind eyes, eyes that had seen both suffering and recovery. Her white coat bore a few faint stains of the trade, and there was a calm steadiness in her movements, the same kind soldiers had before stepping into danger. When she saw Jake holding the trembling puppy wrapped in a blanket, her expression softened immediately. "Bring her here," she said gently. "We'll take care of her." Jake followed her into the examination room. The walls were lined with old medical charts and shelves of supplies, a small space that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender soap. Lydia set down a stethoscope, pulled on gloves, and began to check Hope's heartbeat. Her touch light, but efficient. "She's severely undernourished," she murmured, almost to herself. "But the pulse is steady. That's good." She looked up at Jake with a faint smile. "You did the right thing bringing her here. Most wouldn't have bothered." Jake shifted uneasily, scratching at his jaw. "Didn't feel like a choice," he said. His voice carried that deep rasp of someone who'd spent too many nights in wind and smoke. "She needed help." Lydia nodded, understanding more than his words. "We'll keep her warm, give her fluids. She'll need antibiotics, too." She paused, studying him for a moment. "You're the seal who lives up by the cliffs, aren't you?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "Used to be," he replied simply. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, not the kind that judged, but one that carried quiet respect. "Used to be is still something," she said, before turning back to the small creature on the table. "Sometimes that's enough." The door behind them opened, letting in a rush of cold air and the scent of roasted coffee. A woman stepped inside, brushing snowflakes from her coat. She was in her early 30s, with chestnut hair that fell in loose waves over her shoulders and eyes the color of late autumn, deep, warm, but shadowed by loss. Her hands were red from the cold, holding a paper tray with 2 steaming cups. She paused when she saw Jake, her gaze curious but gentle. "Morning, Lydia," she greeted softly. "I brought your usual." Then her eyes moved to the puppy. "Oh, is she all right?" "Getting there," Lydia replied, smiling faintly. "Emily, this is Jake Harris." "Jake? Emily Green? She runs the Harbor Light Cafe down the street." Emily set the coffee tray on the counter, her movements careful. There was something graceful about her, even in her worn wool coat and scuffed boots, the quiet grace of someone who had known grief but learned to carry it with dignity. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's beautiful. What happened to her?" "Found her tied up in the snow," Jake said, eyes still on the puppy. "Didn't think she'd make it." Emily's expression softened with both sorrow and admiration. She reached out, gently adjusting the blanket around Hope. "You saved a life," she said simply. Then, after a pause, she added, "That still matters, you know. Doing something kind when the world doesn't expect it." Jake looked at her, caught off guard by the quiet conviction in her tone. He gave a small, almost shy nod. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just couldn't walk away." Emily smiled, the kind of smile that came from understanding rather than joy. "Sometimes that's the same thing." She picked up one of the coffee cups and handed it to him. "You look like you need this more than I do." Jake hesitated, then took it. The warmth seeped through his gloves, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he wanted to drink or just hold it. "Thanks," he said finally. Lydia glanced between them with the faintest hint of amusement. "Emily's good at rescuing strays, too," she remarked. "People, dogs, whatever wanders into her cafe." Emily chuckled softly. "Maybe I just like believing broken things can be fixed." The sound of Shadow's nails clicking on the floor broke the silence. The old dog had settled near the doorway, watching the room with calm intelligence. Emily crouched slightly to meet his gaze, her hand hovering before she gently stroked his head. "And you must be the loyal one," she said warmly. Shadow's tail thumped once in reply. Jake found himself smiling, almost involuntarily. It felt strange and good. When Lydia finished treating Hope, she handed Jake a small bag of medicine and instructions. "She'll need rest," she said, "and someone patient." "I've got the time," he replied, tucking the bag into his jacket. As he turned to leave, Emily followed him to the door. Outside, the street glistened with slush, and the faint sound of gulls echoed from the harbor. She handed him a small folded blanket and a paper bag. "Something for her," she said, nodding toward Hope, "and a sandwich for you. It's on the house." He opened his mouth to protest, but her expression stopped him. There was no pity in her eyes, only simple kindness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Take care of her, Jake," Emily replied. "The world needs more people who don't walk away." As he stepped outside, snowflakes began to fall again, softer this time. Shadow trotted beside him, and Hope stirred beneath the blanket, warm and alive. Jake glanced once more through the clinic window and saw Emily talking with Lydia, their laughter faint but real. For a brief, fleeting moment, Cedar Harbor didn't feel so cold. Later that afternoon, while driving back along the cliffs, Jake noticed movement near a dumpster behind an abandoned diner. He slowed the truck. A man was hunched there, rummaging through trash bags, his coat torn, face gaunt. Recognition flickered. One of the men from the alley that night. The one who'd said to leave the puppy to die. Jake cut the engine and stepped out. The man froze, startled, his eyes wary and bloodshot. He looked older now, though he couldn't have been more than 35. Dirt smudged his face, and a patchy beard covered a jaw that once might have been strong. Without a word, Jake opened the truck door, pulled out a small paper bag and a rolled blanket. He walked over and set them beside the man. "There's food," he said simply, "and something warm." The man stared at him, confusion softening into disbelief. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. Jake shrugged. "Because no one else will." He turned back toward the truck. The man's voice came again, unsteady. "No one's ever." Done that before." Jake didn't answer. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove off through the falling snow. In the rear-view mirror, he caught a glimpse of the man still standing there, clutching the blanket to his chest like something sacred. Back at the cabin, the wind had quieted. Jake carried Hope inside, set her near the fire, and watched Shadow curl protectively beside her. For the first time since he'd returned from war, the silence of the place didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. The storm had eased by nightfall, leaving Cedar Harbor wrapped in a brittle silence. The wind that swept across the cliffs carried the scent of salt, smoke, and distant pine. Inside the small cabin perched above the dark sea, the fire in the hearth burned low, throwing shifting amber light across the wooden walls. Jake Harris sat at the table, sharpening a small hunting knife by habit, though he had no real need for it. Shadow lay near the door, head resting on his paws, while Hope, now nearly 2 months old, slept curled by the fireplace, her soft breathing steady and innocent. Jake glanced at her and smiled faintly. The scars on his face looked softer in the firelight, though the years behind them still pressed heavily. It had been weeks since he'd gone into town. He had started patching the roof, fixing broken hinges, keeping himself busy, a soldier's way of coping. Sometimes, late at night, the memories still clawed their way back. The flash of explosions, the sound of Rex's last bark, the weight of silence after the blast. But lately, that silence had been filled by small sounds: Hope's clumsy footsteps, Shadow's sighs, the whisper of wind against the cabin. That night, he poured himself a cup of instant coffee and leaned back in the chair, watching the sparks rise from the fire. It was peaceful in that fragile way that made him wary, as though the world itself held its breath. Then came the sound, a sharp crack, quick and wrong. He frowned, turning toward the fireplace. Another pop, louder this time. A curl of smoke leaked from the side of the chimney, where old mortar had split. "Damn it," he muttered, rising to his feet. The chimney had been cracked for months, but he thought he'd sealed it. He grabbed a bucket of water, ready to douse the small flare of flame crawling up the inside wall. But the moment he opened the iron door, a gust of wind roared through the open vents, feeding the embers into life. The fire exploded outward, licking up the beams like hungry hands. "Shadow! Hope!" Jake's voice cut through the cabin. Shadow was already on his feet, barking loud and sharp. Hope whimpered confused, her small body trembling near the hearth. Smoke filled the air fast, thick, black, choking. Jake coughed hard, eyes watering, as he lunged forward and scooped Hope into his arms. "Come on, buddy," he called to Shadow. They made for the door, but the old hinges glowed red, the handle searing hot to the touch. He tried the window, the glass fogged with heat, the frame warped. He grabbed a chair and swung it hard, once, twice, until the pane shattered, shards scattering into the snow outside. Heat pressed at his back. The fire climbed the walls, turning the cabin into a living furnace. The roof began to groan, a terrible sound of old wood surrendering. Jake hoisted Hope against his chest and shouted, "Shadow, out!" The dog bounded through the broken window, landing in the snow with a yelp. Jake turned to follow, but his vision blurred from smoke, his lungs searing. The room swayed around him. For a split second he thought of Afghanistan again, the blinding light, the roar, the helplessness. Not again, he thought, not like this. Then, through the din, came a voice, muffled but real. "Jake, where are you?" It was shouted through the storm of fire and wind, human, desperate. He blinked, disoriented. "Here," he rasped, but his voice barely rose above the roar. A crash followed, wood splintering. Shadows moved outside the window. Someone was breaking through the wall. A figure appeared through the smoke, coughing, eyes wild. It was Tom. The man looked different now, his scruffy beard frosted with snow, his coat patched, but his expression clear, determined. Two others stood behind him, both faces familiar from that night in the alley. The men who'd once huddled by a fire of trash and despair. One held a crowbar, the other a wet blanket. "Come on, man!" Tom yelled, pulling his sleeve over his mouth as he staggered into the heat. Jake could barely stand. His knees buckled as he tried to move. Hope pressed to his chest. Tom reached him, grabbed his arm, and together they stumbled toward the shattered window. The other men tore more boards away, widening the opening until the cold air rushed in. Jake tumbled out first, landing hard on the snow, coughing violently. Hope squirmed weakly in his arms, but was alive. Shadow barked beside them, frantic, circling his master. Tom and the others followed seconds later, collapsing in the snow. Behind them, the cabin's roof gave way with a groan that echoed down the cliffs. The fire roared upward, bright and merciless, painting the night in shades of orange and grief. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Only the crackling fire filled the silence. The cold bit at their faces, but none dared move away. Jake sat upright, cradling Hope, staring at what was left of the only place he'd allowed himself to belong since the war. His breath came out in shaky clouds. Tom was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "We saw the smoke from the road," he said, wiping soot from his face. "Didn't think, just ran." He gave a short laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Guess the world gives second chances to stubborn fools." Jake turned to look at him. Tom's face, lit by the burning glow, was streaked with ash and tears. The other two men sat nearby, coughing, exhausted but alive. For the first time, Jake saw them not as drifters or shadows, but as men like him, broken in different ways, still fighting for air. "You shouldn't have come in," Jake said quietly, voice thick with emotion. Tom shook his head. "You didn't walk away from that dog," he said, nodding toward Hope. "Didn't walk away from me either. Maybe I figured it was time someone didn't walk away from you." Jake's throat tightened. The flames reflected in his eyes, and for a second they looked like tears. "You saved us," he murmured. Tom smiled weakly, shoulders trembling. "Maybe God was giving me another shot," he said. "You saved a life that night, Jake. Tonight I just returned the favor." Jake couldn't answer. He reached out, gripping Tom's shoulder, firm, silent, full of meaning. Shadow pressed close, resting his muzzle on Jake's leg, while Hope, safe in his lap, gave a faint, sleepy whine. Around them, the snow began to fall again, soft and pure, slowly burying the embers that had once been home. Hours later, the fire had died, leaving only smoke rising into the dawn. The four men sat together, their bodies steaming in the cold, their faces turned toward the horizon. The first light of morning painted the sky pink over the sea. Jake finally spoke, voice rough but steady. "When you've been through the fire," he said quietly, "you don't come out the same." Tom nodded. "Maybe not," he replied, "but maybe you come out better." Jake looked down at Hope, then at Shadow, then at the man beside him, a man who had once been lost and now had found his own redemption in flame. "Yeah," he said, "maybe you do." The first thaw of spring swept through Cedar Harbor like a breath long held. Snow that had blanketed the cliffs for months melted into rivulets, running down toward the restless sea. The burned patch where Jake Harris's cabin once stood was now overgrown with tender shoots of green, fragile yet stubborn, the kind of life that rose quietly from ruin. Not far from that place, a new building stood where the scent of coffee mingled with sawdust and sea air. Its wooden sign swung gently in the breeze. Haven Rescue Cafe. Jake stood outside, hammer in hand, fixing the last hinge of a window frame. His sleeves were rolled, showing strong forearms scarred from both war and labor. The years of silence had softened him somehow, not in strength, but in expression. The hard lines around his mouth had eased, and his blue-gray eyes, once shadowed, now held a calm kind of light. Hope trotted at his feet, no longer the frail pup she had been. Her fur had turned a rich golden brown, her tail waving like a banner. Shadow, his muzzle grayer now, watched nearby, stretched out in the sun as if finally allowing himself to rest. Behind Jake, laughter drifted from the open doorway. Inside, Emily Green was arranging flowers on the wooden tables. Wild daisies and baby's breath gathered from the hills. Her hair caught the sunlight, streaked with amber, and her movements carried the quiet assurance of someone who had rebuilt not just a place, but a purpose. The cafe's air smelled of baked bread, brewed coffee, and something softer, maybe healing. Dr. Lydia Brooks leaned against the counter, arms folded, wearing her work jacket still speckled with paint from the sign she and Jake had hung the day before. Her face was more relaxed now, her eyes holding that rare peace that came when work and compassion met in one place. "Looks like we're really doing it," she said, glancing toward Emily. "A place that's part shelter, part cafe. You think people will come?" Emily smiled, her tone warm but certain. People always come where there's warmth and where someone remembers their name. From the back of the cafe came the steady sound of tools. Tom worked there, repairing an old wooden bench. The months since the fire had changed him. The hollow look of a man running from his past was gone. His hair was trimmed, his beard neat, his eyes clear. He moved with purpose, focused but content. Jake stepped inside, wiping sweat from his brow. "Bench still holding up?" he asked. Tom grinned, holding up the screwdriver. "Better than me some days, but yeah, she'll do." His voice carried quiet pride. They shared a look, the kind of wordless understanding forged not in conversation, but in survival. Jake nodded toward the shelf. "Emily says we're opening next week." Tom's grin widened. "Think the world's ready for a cafe run by a bunch of misfits and one Navy SEAL?" Jake chuckled. "They'll come for the coffee, stay for the company." Lydia walked over, brushing sawdust from the counter. "And the dogs," she added. "Don't forget the dogs." As if on cue, Hope bounded inside, followed closely by Shadow. The puppy turned guardian barked happily, chasing sunlight on the floorboards. Shadow, slower but dignified, found his usual spot near the stove and settled with a sigh. The sight made everyone pause. Hope had grown strong, her steps confident, her eyes clear and bright. The quiet miracle of her survival had become the heart of this place. Outside, a group of children from the town played near the fence, tossing a stick for Hope. Their laughter mingled with the cries of distant gulls. The sound drifted through the open windows, filling the cafe with life. Emily carried a tray of mugs to the porch, where Jake was tightening a signpost. She set one cup beside him. "You've been working since dawn again," she said softly. "Habit," he replied, tightening the final screw. She leaned on the railing, looking out at the sea. "You know," she began, voice low, "if you hadn't stopped that night in the snow..." none of this would exist. Jake took the mug from her hand, watching the steam curl upward. The horizon shimmered gold under the rising sun. "Maybe," he said, "but if no one had run into the fire, I wouldn't be here either." Their eyes met, a quiet exchange that needed no words. Behind them, Hope barked once, as if agreeing, and the two of them laughed. Tom stepped onto the porch, carrying a wooden board. "Sign's ready," he announced. The others turned to see. He'd carved it himself, each letter carefully burned into the surface. Haven Rescue, where hope begins again. The letters were uneven, imperfect, but that only made them beautiful. Lydia brushed her hand over the words. "It's perfect," she whispered. They mounted the sign above the door. Beneath it, Lydia fixed a small bronze plaque she had ordered weeks before. The engraving read, "Dedicated to those who chose kindness when it was hardest." The words gleamed softly in the morning light. For a moment, they all stood together in silence. 4 people and 2 dogs, bound not by blood, but by what they had given each other. The wind off the sea lifted Emily's hair, brushed the fur on Hope's back, and carried the smell of coffee through the harbor streets. As the day wore on, locals began to appear. Fishermen, shopkeepers, a mail carrier, even an old woman from town bringing a stray kitten in her arms. Lydia greeted each with a calm smile. Emily served coffee, her laugh warm as the sun. Tom fixed a broken chair for one of the guests. And Jake? He stood near the door, watching, guarding, though his heart was at ease. For once he didn't feel like a man hiding from ghosts. He felt like a man who had found his place among the living. Later, as twilight softened the edges of the sky, the last of the visitors left. The cafe lights glowed golden through the windows. Shadow rested under the porch steps while Hope played outside with the children, chasing the tide's retreat. Jake leaned against the doorway, sipping the last of his coffee. Emily joined him, her sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows, a few strands of hair caught by the wind. "Looks like home," she said softly. "It is," Jake replied. His gaze lingered on the sea, where the sun melted into waves. "And it's more than I thought I'd ever have again." Emily smiled, her voice almost a whisper. "That's the thing about hope. It doesn't need much, just someone willing to believe." A breeze rolled in from the ocean, gentle and clean. The wooden sign creaked above them, the carved words catching the fading light. Jake looked up at it and murmured, "Miracles don't fall from the sky, do they?" Emily shook her head, eyes glistening. "No," she said, "they grow from people like you." Jake smiled faintly. "From people like us." Hope ran past them, barking joyfully as a wave crashed in the distance. Shadow lifted his head, tail sweeping the porch. Somewhere a gull cried, a wild, beautiful sound that echoed over the cliffs. Jake looked at the horizon one last time, his voice quiet, carried by the wind. The miracle isn't the fire we survive, it's what we build after. And with that, the evening light folded over Cedar Harbor, over the cafe that stood as proof that kindness could rebuild what loss had burned away. In the quiet harbor of life, every act of kindness, no matter how small, becomes a spark that can rebuild what the world once burned down. Jake's story reminds us that miracles don't fall from the sky. They rise from the courage to care, the strength to forgive, and the choice to love again after loss. In our everyday lives, we all carry the power to be someone's haven rescue, by lending a hand, offering warmth, or simply refusing to walk away when others do. Sometimes, the difference between despair and hope is just one person who decides to care. Tell us, Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness that changed your day? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else. If this story touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help more people believe that hope can begin again, anywhere, anytime.